is October of 1962, and a U-2 spy plane from the US has just spied Soviet missiles being set up in communist Cuba. This alarms the American people because up until this point, the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, have been in a clash of ideals and an arms race. Now, with the revolution in Cuba, its leader Fidel Castro has just agreed with Premier Nikita Khrushchev a nuclear missile department just around 100 miles from the coast of Florida. President John F. Kennedy tirelessly lobbies Khrushchev to remove the missiles from Cuba, but to little avail. While everyone is at the edge of their seat, the likelihood of World War III becomes too real. In 1955, Fidel Castro meets Cuban revolutionist Che Guevara in Mexico. The two led a movement of guerrilla forces to overthrow the Cuban dictator at the time, Fulgencio Batista. It was called the July 26 movement and was named after an attack on an army barrack in an attempt to overthrow Batista. Throughout the late 50s, they gained more and more support from people because of their common goal to overthrow the inefficient government. Eventually, on January 1st, 1959, Batista stepped down, and Fidel Castro became the leader, quickly making Cuba into the first Western communist country. And he came to despise America. He nationalized Cuba's industries and commerce from private control and made them under public ownership. These policies that he put in place divided the United States and Cuba. Castro had also started to make relations with the Soviet Union, which created distrust. March 1960. The US has seen Cuba as a threat, and so President Dwight D. Eisenhower orders an armed CIA force that includes Cuban exiles to prepare for an invasion of Cuba to quell the communist regime. A year later, on April 17, 1961, President John F. Kennedy launched an American landing at the Bay of Pigs. However, 10 days earlier, the plans for the invasion were leaked, giving Castro time to be ready. Nevertheless, the US went through with it, although Kennedy decided to scale back air support. This would be one of many blunders that would make the Bay of Pigs invasion an absolute catastrophe. Around 1,200 Cuban exiles landed on the shores of Cuba in hopes of sparking an overthrow, but Castro's military quickly gained the upper hand as his air force took out American supply ships. Over 1,000 Cuban exiles were captured and more than 100 were killed. After the disaster, Kennedy addressed his mistake and took full responsibility for the failed invasion. All of this caused Castro to seek aid from the USSR and what would become the closest the world has gotten to nuclear annihilation. October 14, 1962. Pilot Richard Heiser spots Soviet medium-range missiles while flying over Cuba in a U-2 spy plane. He photographs them and takes them to the US, where President Kennedy is briefed about the situation 2 days later. Just around 100 miles from the coast of Florida, the Soviet missiles had a range that could take out most of the US mainland. So, the president immediately began weighing his options for removal of the missiles, but without triggering a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. What Kennedy ended up deciding on was a naval blockade, and so, on October 22, 1962, he delivered his decision to the American people.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Fear spread across the country as one wrong move could mean all-out nuclear war. Throughout the next few days, Soviet ships were stopped at the blockade and were either turned back for carrying weapons or let in. However, Premier Khrushchev still didn't back down, and instead, a U-2 aircraft was shot down over Cuba. The United States Armed Forces moved to DEFCON 3, which meant an increased readiness for war. President Kennedy had contacted Khrushchev many times to dismantle the missile production, but shaky communication had resulted in very little being done to resolve the crisis. This caused troops to prepare for the invasion of Cuba, and tensions were at an all-time high. It was at this point when the whole world braced for a Third World War. However, on the following day, Khrushchev proposed to remove the missiles only if Kennedy removed his missiles from Turkey. The two sides eventually came into agreement, and disaster was averted. A 13-day standoff was the closest the world came to World War III, and it would go down in history as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Still, Even with the crisis being over, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union raged on for most of the late 20th century.